Greetings and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News and chalkboardnews.com. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, which publishes Chalkboard. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K through 12 education. Joining me again today is Brendan Clary, Chalkboard's K through 12 editor. We are recording this on July 5th, a Wednesday this week. Brendan, you wrote recently at chalkboardnews.com about restorative discipline practices. Before we get into a conversation about that and why it's becoming more and more commonplace in schools across the country, just explain to our listeners what restorative discipline is.
Yeah, restorative discipline, restorative justice, restorative practices. It's sort of this idea that you can get through to students who have violated the rules in some way without a punitive sort of discipline measure. So it's not like it's a kind of response to these hardline zero tolerance policies that a lot of school districts around the country had, in the 90s and the 2000s, from what I've been told. So it actually started in the criminal justice sort of world. And then it was, I think, Australia that started using it in schools first. And that became sort of a mainstream thing in the last 10 years or so, that a lot of schools were thinking about restorative practices and restorative justice. So essentially it would be, there's different kinds of restorative justice in how it works. And I think a lot of it on the front end is trying to create a classroom where students feel seen and they understand that this is a learning environment. And then when they do something to disrupt that or to hurt that environment, then they're, made aware of this is a problem. This is where you've, hurt the classroom. And so we're going to talk about it. And so there's a lot of communication about that and sort of like a building awareness of what your actions have done. And so then there's also, different kinds of meetings as well that students might have with administrators before they're expelled. And they often are expelled. This isn't like a complete, like we're going to not do anything to students, but I think it puts some more guardrails and it can maybe make that pathway to expulsion or, suspension a little bit less direct.
And to some extent, there's at least a bit of a racial undertone to this, in that there was concerns that, for example, Black students or Latino students were getting disciplined more harshly than, for example, white students. So it's an attempt to address that as well.
Yeah, I think that is another thing that especially the Department of Education and the Department of Justice have said is an issue, is this disproportionate these racial disparities in discipline that they're trying to bring down. So, like, for example, if a school district has, 28% of a certain kind of ethnicity or a race in their school district, then why do they make the majority of, expulsions or suspensions? And so they're trying to figure out, like, is it the discipline, like our discipline policies? And then I think there's also a push to reduce suspensions as well, just kind of all across the board, because if students are not in class, then they're not learning. And if they're not learning, they're falling farther behind. And, there's these ramifications for your life if you're not able to get the schooling that you need because you're, in out of school suspension or in school suspension or, expelled. So I think that there's kind of a push on that end as well. And I think restorative justice can, the advocates say that is a way to try to keep those suspensions lower. And they have seen that working. So
in theory, it does make sense. You want people, whether it's the criminal justice system, and we're talking about adults, you want them after they, pay their penalty, their punishment, whatever it might be, for a crime, they get out of jail. You want them to become contributing members of society. You don't want them to continue committing crimes and it's just a revolving door into the criminal justice system. You can say the same thing about the school system with younger students, with minors who are at school. You'd rather them continue to grow and to learn as young individuals, so when they graduate, they can either move on to a career, to a workforce, or go to college and then contribute to society after that. But I guess my question is, in theory, it sounds good, but in practice, how well is it working?
Yeah, the first part of that is that I think that there isn't a focus on that in restorative justice of, like, here's the people that you've hurt, and so we're going to still expel you, but you need to write a letter to the people and we're going to sit down with all the families involved of every, the person that was maybe bullied in a hallway, that kind of thing. And then also I think there's a community service aspect as well that is kind of focused on. But there are some critics of this who say, this does not give teachers the tools they need to manage their classroom effectively. And so the Nevada State Educators Association, the NEA branch for Nevada, they basically said, this 2019 law that they have that instated restorative practices in schools, they said this does not actually help us to discipline students in an effective way. So they, would talk to students out in class, and then the next day the students are back in and they're, disrupting things. And so there's not a lot of tools. And there's a recent piece as well kind of said that if we want to restore order in the classrooms and help there being a learning environment, their teachers need to be able to remove students who are making a scene, and then not just have them go to the office that day and be back the next day. Or, if they're doing worse things. And teachers that I've talked to have indicated similar kind of issues that, they have students who are not following the rules, and then they're reported to the administration. Administration basically gives them a slap on the wrist, and they're back in class the next day for, these somewhat serious broaches of policy.
And I would just add to that, and that would have ramifications for the entire classroom. You have one disruptive student, disruptive day in and day out. I appreciate the system wanting to try and reform this student so they're just not disrupting the class every day, but they're not just being disruptive for themselves. Every other student in that class is affected by those disruptions, those constant disruptions. So this is a tough one for me.
It is tough. On the one hand, we can't have racial disparities in discipline that are, maybe racially biased, or, that you assume that because the color of some of a student's skin that they were, more culpable than somebody else. And, there are studies showing that there is an element perhaps of bias in these different kinds of discipline policies. And that's something that the Department of Justice and the Education Department released together, was about these kind of discipline practices. But at the same time, we have to have a learning environment where all students can be participants and have a place where they feel safe. And I think that, there's that goal with restorative justices and with restorative justice to have that safe learning environment. But whether it gets there, I think, might be an implementation issue. So you could have a very good set of goals, but if teachers aren't told exactly how to do it right, and, administrators are not told exactly how to do it right, then maybe you have kind of a haphazard, not a very clear policy about what should happen next. And then maybe that leads to issues as well. And the experts that I talked to said, it's very costly to do this right. It's a time commitment to do this right. And she even said that the age of the student matters. So she said middle schoolers are not always receptive to, sort of sitting down in a circle and talking about their feelings. And I think that that's just part of being in middle school, maybe, is that you can't kind of access those parts of your brain, or you're not willing to with your peers. But in elementary school and high school, that was effective. So it's an interesting, and also there's class time that has to be taken out if you're going to have sort of this preventative aspect about what restorative justice looks like. So then you're maybe trading off, some educational or some learning time for these restorative justice practices. So I think that's the complicating. There's a lot of complicated stuff going into this. It's a really big issue, but something that we've seen in recent years, and I think we'll probably see more of.
Just for our listeners, I think we've probably both, Brendan and I have probably used restorative justice and restorative discipline is the same thing. And while there might be slight differences, one's referring to criminal justice and one's referring to discipline, we are meaning restorative discipline as it relates to this classroom and student discipline. Brendan, this is a fascinating topic, and I know it's relatively new, so maybe there'll be some more data about the successes using restorative discipline in the classrooms, and certainly be looking for that, and we'll report on that at Chalkboard News. But for this week, we are out of time. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.